and in this video I am going to be explaining 6 subgenres, so different categories of fantasy, and also giving examples of different fantasy books in those categories. So without further ado, let's get into them. You might have heard of high fantasy or epic fantasy. I've got them as something combined in this video, and those high epic fantasies usually encompass a very broad scope with a lot of world building. So you can probably guess the first book I'm going to talk about, which is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. It's his first book in the Stormlight Archive, and the high epic fantasy setting also includes characters that are probably going to rally and fight back against the darkness. And true to form, this is a tale about ambition, honor, and also overcoming adversity. A war is waged on what is called the Shattered Plains, which is a specific broad location in this story, and all of the high princes, which are like this world's version of nobles, are involved in this fight, which is to avenge a king that died many moons ago. One of the key characters in this story is named Kaladin, and he started his life as a surgeon. He was conscripted to become a soldier, so he went from healing people to killing them, and now in the beginning of this book it opens with him being on a slave cart, so he's hit the bottom of rock bottom. He is a character that fights for survival and inspires loyalty though, so again he's fighting against that darkness that is sometimes literal and sometimes his own internal darkness to pursue that hero archetype. He's very much a heroic character, and he's also one of my favorite characters. Another book as an example of high or epic fantasy has a grand scope, and that is The Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyons. Now, this is a book that primarily follows Kieran, and he is an orphan who grew up listening to stories of long-lost princes and tales of grand quests, when one day he is claimed by one of the factions of the royal houses, and he realizes that he is the long-lost son of a treasonous prince. From this claiming, afterwards he must try and survive in this cutthroat court, and he's really at the mercy of his family's power plays. This story is grand in scope because it's got demons, it's got gods, detailed family lore that crosses over with magic, true love as well, and prophecies. But is Kieran the hero? Usually the hero always wins, but Kieran is part of a prophecy that is linked to the destruction of the world, and he is not necessarily the bringer of light in this prophecy. Now, the next subgenre I want to talk about is heroic fantasy, and this captures sword fighting, swashbuckling, usually heroes on some sort of quest, and I wanted to talk about Traitor's Blade for this one. To me, this hero on a quest narrative in the Traitor's Blade series is more character infused in the sense that we've got these magistrates who are the Greatcoats, and their king has died, and now they're trying to figure out their purpose in the world because he gave each of them a single mission in their life before he was murdered. So we've got Felkio, who was the first Cantor and the leader of the Greatcoats, and he's wrangled 2 of his friends to come with him, and they are accidentally caught up in a whole bunch of politics, and at the beginning of the book they are set up and framed for a murder they didn't commit. So in the sense, they're on a hero's quest to try and answer the questions that their King Palis left them, but they're also trying to clear their own names in a world that does not like the Greatcoats, and they're called Tratari, which are basically traitors. This indeed does have a lot of swashbuckling and sword fighting because this has been described as the 3 Musketeers set in a fantasy world. And even though it's got that hero on a quest narrative with the intense character direction, it also kind of crosses over in a way with the high epic fantasy, because obviously in such a grand world you need characters to center it, and they need to go on their own quests. I feel like The Traitor's Blade is very different in style and tone and intention to what The Way of Kings is, and that is a good thing. When I read fantasy, I want some varied stuff, so I loved this one and I loved The Way of Kings. Next I've got urban or low fantasy, and that is when the magical intrudes on the real world. So there is an element of familiarity, and it's almost like you could turn a corner and see a magical creature or someone using magic. It feels like it's that accessible to the reader. Harry Potter would probably be a pretty good example, given that they go to platform 9 3/4, which literally exists, and there is magic and wizards in the world. But I wanted to talk about something else for this particular subcategory because the Dresden Files is a perfect example, and Harry Dresden is a wizard detective, so he is a consultant hired by the police when crimes are of a supernatural nature, and this is all set in the city of Chicago. So that real world element is very present, and then he's fighting monsters and vampires and trying to survive against magical spells and dark wizards while also trying to help the police save lives. So in that sense is a definite intersection of magic coming into the real world. I also would like to mention Supernatural, the TV show, for this particular subcategory as well, because that was one of the things that initially got me into loving urban fantasy. Obviously, it's about two brothers that hunt supernatural creatures and demons. So it's in a similar sense to what the Dresden Files is, with those rogue, morally grey characters that are trying to kill off the evil that are killing the people. So they're trying to save lives, but they go down this whole rabbit hole of their own. And Dresden really goes down a huge rabbit hole trying to protect the ones that he loves as well from all of the negativity and the threats of magic in his world. I just love this subgenre, although I find it really difficult to find new ones that I just latch onto and love as much as I've loved Supernatural and the Dresden Files. So any recommendations for any of these subcategories, let me know, because I love fantasy. Then we've got the subgenre or category called romantasy, and this is just fantasy and romance mushed together. Most of the time it is when there is a key plot of romance and then it's set in a fantasy world. So romance is like the forefront and the first thing, and then fantasy supports that whole thing. The romance is essentially the driving plot force. You'll probably be very familiar with this romantasy, Fourth Wing, because it has done huge numbers lately. I feel like I always see someone reading either this or the Sarah J. Maas series, whether it's Throne of Glass or A Court of Thorns and Roses. Either one, and both of those are also romantasy, but Fourth Wing is the one that I want to talk about, which follows Violet, and she has studied her whole life to become a scribe, when one day her mother, who is also the general in this fantasy world, fighting a war against the wyvern monsters outside of their barriers, she decides, no, I'm going to send Violet to the War College instead to become a soldier. And so she takes Violet's whole life and redirects it, and now Violet has to go to essentially this murder school to learn how to ride and understand dragons and history, and also hopefully bond with a dragon without being killed off. And she runs into Xaden, who is this dark and brooding character, and he seems like he doesn't have the time of day for her. He's a character who's very mysterious and has a lot of secrets, and those secrets are linked into the politics and magic of the world, and naturally they catch each other's eye. And it's very much a romance driven for both of those characters, but it also has key fantasy plots, obviously with the dragons and the murder school, that fall into that as well. Another romantasy that I've absolutely adored is Silver Under Nightfall, which follows Remy Pendergast. I've got a whole review for this book and a recap for this book before you read its sequel and conclusion, Court of Wanderers. But Remy is a vampire hunter, and he is sent out on missions by his father, and after he's come back from a particular mission where he noticed something weird about the blood of the vampires that he killed, he's back in the court, and these noble vampires have come to try and make a peace treaty with the city of Illyria, which is where he lives, but something's going on, and this blood that he noticed is actually called the Rot, and it turns people into mutant vampires that are really hard to kill and basically revive every time you kill them. And so he's teaming up with these two noble court vampires who are also husband and wife, and he goes on the road with them on a quest to figure out what is going on with Illyria, the politics, the vampires, and this Rot virus. And along the way they form a male-male, female polyamorous romance, and it really centers their character growth and their trust of each other, and how that builds across the book, and how Remy has internalized a lot of trauma from the way his father has guilt-tripped and manipulated him. So there is all of this prejudice existing for vampires, and yet these noble court vampires want to make a peace treaty anyway. So there is a lot of politics, as you can imagine, but I think it's greatly done because it centers these three and their romance, and I really just love it so much. These characters bring me so much joy, and there is so much humor and spice to this book that is just so much fun. So it is by far my favorite romantasy ever. Then we've got another subcategory called cozy fantasy, and this has been doing the rounds a lot recently as well, and it's not a story like epic fantasy in the sense that it's got a huge world with high stakes. These are very low stakes, localized stories, usually centered in a rural or close-knit community, often in a small town, and its focus is relationships instead of quests. And the key cozy fantasy that I feel like started the wave of hype is Legends and Lattes, because it follows Viv, who is an orc, and she leaves her mercenaries band because she's like, I don't want to live this life anymore. I want to settle down and start a little cafe and coffee shop in a world where no one really is familiar with what coffee is. It is a gnomish delicacy that she tasted on the other side of the world, and she has wanted to revisit that feeling since tasting it. And so she takes all of her bounties and she goes and opens this cafe. This is where the small town element comes in, because she encounters all of her suppliers and her local customers and her regulars and her neighbors, and they form this very tight-knit, close community that really trusts and relies on each other and respects each other. And that is where the beauty of these stories comes through, because they have so much heart and they just make you want to have a cup of tea or coffee or a hot chocolate and just sit under a blanket and be cozy and enjoy this world. That is the vibe that these stories encapsulate. I've also got another recommendation called The House Witch. It is a 3-book series, or maybe a 4-book series so far, and it follows Finn. He is what is called a house witch, so he's got house magic, which is kind of rare. Usually witches are elementals, and in this world witches aren't really revered, so he hides the fact that he can do magic, and he's like, I'm gonna be a cook for this king and queen in their castle, because he loves cooking and that's his specialty. So he comes on board, he does this cooking job, and he begins to build this trusted circle with honesty and being genuine, even though he's hiding the fact that he's a witch. The secret obviously has to come out at some point because he needs to tell the king and everything. So that's not a spoiler at all. It would be a silly story if it's built on the foundations of genuine honesty and trust when he wasn't telling the whole truth to begin with. So it's lovely to see his magic come to fruition, because the more people that treat his kitchen like a cozy, safe space, the more powerful he becomes as a witch. So it's just so cute to see everyone growing to trust him and his magic growing stronger. It's just a beautiful story, and I enjoyed the audiobook, and I haven't seen many people talk about it, which is why I wanted to, because more people need to read and enjoy it. And then lastly, the subcategory or subgenre that I want to discuss is dark fantasy or grim fantasy, and you're probably familiar with Joe Abercrombie or The Blade itself. He writes the dark grim fantasy because that genre has a very dark and gruesome tone, also a sense of realism, generally where power is corrupt, which is very accurate, and protagonists have a lot of agency to do whatever their morals make them want to do on that particular day or minute or hour. And our protagonist Logan is very much that kind of person. Case in point, he is an infamous barbarian. There are other characters in this too. One of them is Inquisitor Glockta, and like I said, power is usually corrupt. He obviously works for the Inquisition and he tortures people behind closed doors in order to get information. There is also Giselle as well, and he is part of the monarchy, and he's not a very great person either. So there is a whole sense of realism in the fact that all of these characters are for themselves rather than for some greater good, in a very opposing way to the hero fighting for a quest for good and fighting against the darkness. These characters are very real in the sense that they're fighting for themselves. And then the last book that I wanted to talk about in this kind of grim dark fantasy subcategory is The Bone Season, and while this is set in the year 2059 in what is called Scion London, I feel like it could be called a urban fantasy, but also I feel like it very much could fit into this grim dark category as well, because Paige Mahoney is 19 years old. She's a clairvoyant, which means she's got a particular kind of magic, which means she can commune with ghosts, and she's a dream walker, so she can invade people's minds. And her criminal overlord boss, Jackson Hall, he employs her to break into people's minds. So there are those mixed morals, or those skewed morals, and this world is dark with a corrupt power because the clairvoyants are seen as criminals simply just because they are breathing. Scion London do not want clairvoyants in their city, and so they hunt them down and they send them away. Paige is hunted down by Scion when she's just taking the train home. She's captured and taken to the secret city of Oxford, which has been secret for 200 years, and she's trained up by these otherworldly creatures that also live there, and she's trained to fight otherworldly monsters that come from the same world as these creatures. So it's very deeply fantasy with magic, but it's also very morally corrupt with that whole criminal undertone and the ghosts and clairvoyant magic system in here too. I think this story is fantastic and very detailed. It is a worthwhile read, and I don't see people talk about it as much anymore, but there was a whole wave of when this was super popular, and I really hope that wave comes back around. But those are all of the subgenres that I wanted to talk about today. Of course, there are so many more than what I just talked about in this video, but if you have any additional subgenres, if you've got any recommendations on any of these subgenres, I would love to hear them, so let me know down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll come chat to you down below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.